September 10th, 1944. A gray drizzle hung over the airfields and barracks of southern England as Major Brian Urquhart sat alone in his cramped office at British Airborne Headquarters, a magnifying glass pressed to his eye. Spread across his desk were fresh reconnaissance photographs taken by Royal Air Force pilots hours earlier. The black and white images showed roads, fields, bridges, and clusters of buildings in the Netherlands. At first glance, they looked like every other set of photos he had spent the past months analyzing. But as Urquhart slowly moved the glass over a patch of woodland outside the Dutch town of Arnhem, his stomach tightened. There, half hidden under trees and camouflage netting, were the shapes he had been dreading. Intact German tanks, half-tracks, and supply vehicles lined up in orderly rows. It was not the debris of a beaten army. It was a force getting ready to fight. Urquhart pulled more photographs toward him, flipping from one overlapping frame to the next. The pattern was unmistakable. Tanks here, armored vehicles there, billeted troops, radio trucks, ammunition dumps. For weeks he had been reading similar signals. Ultra-intercepts of German communications pointed to SS divisions refitting in the Netherlands. Dutch resistance fighters had sent urgent reports about increased patrols, new checkpoints, and heavy vehicle movements near Arnhem. Now the photographs confirmed what his instincts and paperwork had already told him. The Germans were not weak in that sector. They were rebuilding their strength directly on top of the area where Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery planned to drop tens of thousands of Allied paratroopers in just 1 week. He gathered the photographs into a folder, tucked the latest ultra summaries under his arm, and left his office, walking quickly toward the headquarters of Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning, commander of the British Airborne Corps. Urquhart was only 25 years old, but he had been working intelligence for airborne operations since before the Normandy landings. His job was to see the threats other people missed. He had seen enough. Inside Browning's office, Urquhart laid the photographs out carefully on the desk and pointed to the silhouettes of tanks around Arnhem. He described the intercepts, the resistance reports, the accumulating evidence that 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, were refitting right where the British intended to land. Browning listened, but only up to a point. He glanced at the photographs, frowned slightly, and then leaned back in his chair. The Germans were finished, he said. They were in retreat all across France and the Low Countries. These units were probably exhausted remnants trying to reorganize, not preparing for a major battle. Urquhart insisted that this was not speculation, that the photos showed operational tanks with support vehicles, that the intercepts and resistance reports all aligned. Browning's expression hardened. Caution was one thing. Paralyzing doubt was another. In his view, the plan could not be strangled before it began just because one intelligence officer saw danger everywhere he looked. Outside Browning's headquarters, the mood across Montgomery's command had shifted dramatically since the summer. In August 1944, Montgomery had been basking in applause. His forces had played a leading role in the Normandy campaign, and British newspapers celebrated him as the man who had helped break Hitler's grip on France. German armies were retreating in disorder. Many believed Allied victory was now just a matter of time. Montgomery, however, was not content to simply grind forward. He wanted a decisive blow, a single dramatic operation that would end the war quickly and secure his place as the architect of victory. Operation Market Garden became that opportunity. 3 airborne divisions would land deep behind enemy lines to seize a chain of bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. British armored forces would then dash more than 60 miles along a thin, elevated road, sometimes no wider than 2 lanes, with canals and flat open fields on either side. If the road was blocked at any point by wrecked vehicles, blown bridges, or German counterattacks. The entire advance would stall. The paratroopers at the far end, especially those at Arnhem, would be left isolated, lightly equipped, and in grave danger. Every element of the plan depended on flawless timing, clear weather, weak enemy resistance, and good luck. It was, in other words, a gamble. At Supreme Headquarters, Dwight D. Eisenhower knew it. His instinct was to continue the broad front strategy that had carried the Allies across France. Steady advances everywhere, never giving the Germans a gap or a flank to exploit. His staff shared his unease. Autumn weather over northern Europe was notoriously unpredictable. Yet the political pressure on Eisenhower was enormous. British newspapers wanted a spectacular British victory. Montgomery complained that American generals were getting the glory. Winston Churchill pressed Eisenhower to give his most famous British commander a major role. Montgomery argued that Market Garden was the answer. Give him priority for fuel, aircraft, and supplies, he said, and he would end the war by Christmas. Eisenhower, calculating in both military and political terms, finally agreed. If Montgomery succeeded, the war might end early. If he failed, at least the complaints about strategy might quiet down. The green light was given. The operation moved forward. Back at British Airborne Headquarters, Urquhart paid the price for telling an unwelcome truth. After his meeting with Browning, the whispers began. Some staff officers said he was overstrained, that months of work under pressure had made him jumpy. Others muttered that he was simply too cautious, that he saw danger where there was none. When his warnings reached Montgomery's headquarters, the reaction was even colder. The operation had already been sold to Eisenhower, to Churchill, to the British press. Changing course now would be an admission that the grand plan might be flawed. Instead of reconsidering, Montgomery's staff questioned the judgment of the man raising the alarm. One officer suggested that Urquhart was suffering from nervous exhaustion and should be taken off duty. Shortly afterward, he was ordered to take a week's leave, quietly removed from his post at the very moment his analysis mattered most. The assumptions underpinning Market Garden remained in place. German forces in the Netherlands were assumed to be weak, scattered, and demoralized. Airborne troops were expected to seize and hold major bridges for 48 hours or more without heavy weapons, armor, or adequate resupply. British armor was expected to cover more than 60 miles along that single exposed road in just 2 days. The weather was assumed to cooperate long enough for multiple days of airborne drops and supply flights. Dutch resistance reports were treated selectively, valued when they supported optimism, discounted when they did not. German commanders were presumed too disorganized and stunned to react quickly. Intelligence officers knew that several of these assumptions were already doubtful. But once enthusiasm and prestige had taken control of the process, conflicting evidence was treated as pessimism rather than reality. On the afternoon of Sunday, September 17, 1944, the sky over England filled with aircraft. More than 1,500 transport planes and nearly 500 gliders roared off the runways, carrying approximately 35,000 Allied paratroopers and glider troops toward the Netherlands. It was the largest airborne armada ever assembled. Men of the American 101st Airborne Division headed for drops near Eindhoven. The American 82nd Airborne Division targeted the bridges at Nijmegen and the surrounding high ground. The British 1st Airborne Division, along with Polish paratroopers assigned to reinforce them, flew toward Arnhem, the last and most critical bridge over the lower Rhine. At Arnhem, problems appeared almost immediately. Instead of dropping close to the bridge, British planners had selected landing zones several miles away, partly out of concern about German flak, and partly due to limited suitable terrain. That meant the paratroopers of the 1st Airborne had to march through hostile territory just to reach their main objective. Worse, the German High Command in the region realized what was happening almost instantly. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, happened to be at his headquarters near Arnhem when the first reports of parachute landings came in. Some accounts say he could see the descending parachutes from his window. He needed no elaborate intelligence assessment to understand the danger. If the Allies seized the Arnhem Bridge and linked up with a strong armored column from the south, they could cross the Rhine and drive into Germany itself. Model wasted no time. He called SS General Wilhelm Bittrich, whose 2nd SS Panzer Corps, including the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions, was refitting in the area, the exact threat Brian Urquhart had identified in his reports. These were not shattered remnants. They were battle-hardened units recovering from the fighting in France, with functioning command structures, tanks, artillery, and experienced crews. Bittrich grasped the situation as quickly as Model. The airborne landings were clearly aimed at capturing the bridge at Arnhem and holding it until ground forces arrived. If the Germans could block the British from consolidating in the town and stop the armored advance long enough, the entire Allied operation would collapse. Orders went out at once to move tanks and mechanized infantry toward the likely approach routes and to build a ring of steel around Arnhem. On the ground, the British 1st Airborne moved as fast as they could, but confusion, communications problems, and unexpectedly strong resistance slowed them. Only the 2nd Parachute Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, managed to reach the Arnhem Bridge on the night of September 17th. Around 750 men dug in on the northern end of the span, occupying nearby houses and buildings, and preparing to hold out until the arrival of the British 30 Corps, the armored spearhead advancing up the single highway from the south. Their orders were to hold for 2 days. They would be asked to endure far longer. Meanwhile, British 30 Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Urquhart began its drive that same afternoon. The timetable called for a dash to Eindhoven by nightfall, a rapid link-up with the 101st Airborne, then a push toward Nijmegen, and finally Arnhem. But the road chosen for this race would later earn a bitter nickname: Hell's Highway. It ran like a narrow causeway across flat, low ground, crossed by canals and ditches. In many places, the elevated roadbed left vehicles exposed on both sides. Any knocked-out tank or truck, any crater, any destroyed bridge could halt everything behind it. As German units recovered from the shock of the airborne landings, they began to counterattack the road repeatedly, slipping through fields and orchards to hit the column whenever it paused. Delays began almost immediately. Engineers had to repair damaged bridges. Ambushes forced pauses as German anti-tank guns opened fire from concealed positions. Traffic jams developed as armored vehicles, infantry, artillery, and supply trucks all crowded onto the same thread of asphalt. 30 Corps did reach Eindhoven, but not by the end of the first day. They were already many hours behind schedule when they linked up with the paratroopers there. Every lost hour tightened the noose around the British at Arnhem. While American units of the 82nd fought fiercely for the Nijmegen Bridge, including a desperate assault across the Waal River in small boats under fire, the armored column waited, engines idling, burning fuel and time. Up in Arnhem, Frost's men were paying for those delays with their blood. SS tanks and assault guns began probing the defenses around the northern end of the bridge. Artillery shells crashed into the buildings the paratroopers were using as strong points. The British fought floor by floor, room by room. They knocked out tanks with handheld anti-tank weapons and improvised explosives, but they were desperately short on heavy weapons and ammunition. Radio communications with the rest of the division were unreliable. Frost knew only that the relief promised within 48 hours had not arrived, and the weight of German attacks was increasing. West of Arnhem, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division tried to push through to the bridge and hold a broader perimeter, but they ran into enemy forces much stronger than expected. German units quickly improvised blocking positions, bringing in tanks and self-propelled guns to cut off British attempts to reach Frost. Village streets and wooded lanes became killing grounds. Each hour that passed saw more British casualties and fewer supplies. The supposed weak and demoralized enemy was anything but. They were coordinated, aggressive, and fueled by the knowledge that holding Arnhem meant holding the last major barrier on the road into Germany. By the 4th day of the operation, Wednesday, September 21st, 1944, the situation had turned disastrous for the British 1st Airborne. The pocket of territory they held around the village of Oosterbeek had been squeezed down to a shrinking perimeter, barely a mile across. German artillery pounded their positions relentlessly. Medical stations overflowed with wounded men, treated in cellars and makeshift aid posts under constant shell fire. Ammunition was running low. Supplies dropped by Allied aircraft often fell into German hands, blown off course by wind or confusion. Frost's force at the bridge, having fought with remarkable stubbornness, had finally been overwhelmed. Many of his men were killed or captured after days of continuous combat. 30 Corps, for all its determination, had only reached the southern bank of the Rhine, opposite Arnhem. The river itself remained in German hands. The bridge that was supposed to be the gateway into Germany was now a fortress bristling with enemy guns. Attempts by ground forces to push across met with fierce resistance. Attempts to reinforce the airborne troops from the air fared no better. Polish paratroopers dropped into the battle zone were scattered and then cut down as they tried to assemble under German fire. The weather, predictably unfriendly in late September, turned against the Allies. Low clouds and rain hampered resupply drops and limited close air support at the very moment it was most needed. Despite the clear collapse of his grand design, Montgomery resisted admitting defeat. From his headquarters, he continued to press for renewed attacks, insisting that the situation at Arnhem was not yet hopeless, that with a little more effort, the bridge might still be secured. On the ground, commanders saw the truth. The 1st Airborne Division was on the verge of annihilation. Eventually, a grim decision was made. Under cover of darkness on the night of Monday, September 25, 1944, a desperate evacuation began. Using small boats, assault craft, and anything that would float, British engineers ferried survivors across the cold, fast-flowing Rhine from the north bank to the relative safety of the south. German artillery raked the river. Many men never made it to the far shore, slipping beneath the black water, exhausted, wounded, and dragged down by their equipment. Of roughly 10,000 British and Polish troops who had gone into the Arnhem battle, barely 2,400 escaped. More than 1,400 were killed. Over 6,000 were captured. The 1st Airborne Division, which had been regarded as one of the finest formations in the Allied armies, had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. American casualties at Eindhoven and Nijmegen were serious, but within the expected range for airborne operations. They had, in large part, seized their objectives. It was Arnhem, the key to Montgomery's vision, that turned Market Garden from a daring gamble into a catastrophe. In public, Montgomery refused to shoulder the blame. He pointed to faulty radios that had made communication difficult. He pointed to the weather, which had impeded resupply and close air support. He criticized the pace of 30 Corps, implying that the armored column should have reached Arnhem more quickly. Remarkably, he even claimed that Market Garden had been a success to the tune of 90%. arguing that since most of the bridges had been captured, the operation had achieved the bulk of its aims. To anyone who understood the real objective, this sounded absurd. The point of Market Garden was not simply to grab bridges, it was to cross the Rhine at Arnhem and plunge into Germany. On that decisive measure, the operation had failed completely. Saying it was 90% successful because preliminary steps had worked was like saying the maiden voyage of the Titanic was 90% successful because the ship left Southampton on time. The deeper reason for the disaster was not the weather, the radios, or even the delays on Hell's Highway. It was the mindset that had created the plan in the first place. Montgomery had built Market Garden on assumptions instead of on the full weight of available intelligence. He had dismissed or sidelined warnings that clashed with his desire for a rapid, war-winning blow. When evidence emerged that German armored divisions were refitting near Arnhem, he and his staff chose to interpret it as unimportant, rather than reconsider their scheme. The plan itself left no room for error. Every piece had to fall into place perfectly for success. Yet war seldom grants perfection. When reality intruded, Montgomery's instinct was to protect his reputation, rather than admit the plan had been flawed. In any ruthlessly logical military system, the failure at Arnhem would likely have ended his career. A commander had gambled the lives of elite troops on a plan that violated common sense, ignored accurate intelligence, and depended on luck. When luck ran out, thousands of paratroopers paid with their lives, freedom, or health. Yet Montgomery remained in his position. Churchill could not easily dismiss the man whom British propaganda had celebrated as the hero of El Alamein and Normandy without inviting questions about the government's wartime judgment. British newspapers, constrained by censorship and morale concerns, portrayed Market Garden as a brave attempt that had just fallen short, a noble failure rather than an avoidable tragedy. Eisenhower took note. After Arnhem, he never again gave Montgomery the freedom to launch an independently planned, large-scale operation without close oversight. Montgomery would participate in the final offensives into Germany, but always as part of a broader plan under Eisenhower's direct control. Market Garden had been his chance to prove the superiority of his bold vision. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting ego drive strategy. When Major Brian Urquhart returned from the enforced leave that had removed him from the center of events, Market Garden was over. Arnhem was lost. The casualty figures told a grim story. As he reviewed the reports, the ultra-intercepts, and the very photographs he had once laid on Browning's desk, the full meaning sank in. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions had indeed been where he said they were. Their tanks and guns had smashed British positions around Arnhem and Oosterbeek, encircled Frost's men at the bridge, and hammered the perimeter until evacuation was the only alternative to surrender. The Dutch resistance reports he had forwarded were confirmed line by line in the accounts of German troop movements. The reconnaissance photographs that some had waved away as showing harmless remnants were, in truth, images of the very armor that had torn 1st Airborne Division apart. No one put him on trial for being right. There was no court-martial, no formal reprimand, but there was also no promotion tied to his warnings, no official recognition that he had seen clearly when others chose not to. His analysis, painstaking and accurate, had collided with a plan that powerful men were determined to execute. In that collision between evidence and ambition, evidence lost. The British and Polish paratroopers who fought at Arnhem were left to carry the consequences on their shoulders. They had done everything that could be asked of soldiers. They dropped behind enemy lines, fought against tanks with light weapons, held positions far longer than any realistic timetable allowed, and kept their discipline in the face of mounting chaos. They deserved a plan that took reality into account, one that respected intelligence rather than wished it away. Instead, they received a scheme that gambled their lives on the assumption that the enemy was weak simply because their commander believed it should be so. Montgomery received his grand operation, the supplies, the aircraft, the priority he had demanded. When it failed, his career survived, his reputation largely intact in the eyes of the public. The men of the 1st Airborne Division, by contrast, left their dead in Dutch soil, their wounded in hospitals and prison camps, and their unit shattered beyond immediate repair. The true lesson of Market Garden is written not in triumphant headlines or self-serving memoirs, but in those losses. Arrogance in high command can be just as deadly as enemy fire. No amount of individual courage, no wealth of personal heroism can rescue a plan that was doomed from the outset because its architect refused to listen when the warnings came.